Okay, team, back on the track stitch for an extra special emergency podcast. Recording this one the afternoon, Saturday, November the 22nd. Recorded the main version of the pod earlier this morning with the triumphant return of Shano. Touched on a number of topics, including the NCAA Cross Nationals that had just wrapped up from Columbia, Missouri. I jumped off the recording and had a number of messages come through on my phone asking me if I'd seen what had gone down in the men's race in particular. Should individual athletes be disqualified? Should teams be disqualified? What on earth was going on? So we are going to take a quick look at some of the potentially controversial moments from the race and ask just what on earth was happening. There's no track stitch band. We only pay them for one performance a week. So they are off enjoying the rest of the weekend. So I'm going to be right back and we are going to get straight into some of those potentially controversial moments. So back in a second. Okay, getting right into it. NCAA Cross Nationals is a wrap. On the women's side, as we know, Doris Lemongol with a great win over Jane Hedengren, who is looking to become the first freshman to win the women's race in over 40 years. On the men's side, Habtom Samuel exercises the shoeless ghosts of last year where he was beaten by Graham Blanks. He gets the win. However, there is some controversy coming out of the men's race with respect to athletes cutting corners. These were some of the text messages that I received after recording the first pod earlier today. Did you see what was happening? How bad was it? Should these athletes be disqualified? And at first, my first reaction was, is this another classic case of kind of like a little bit of overzealousness when it comes to rules that we're sometimes guilty of in the sport of running in track and field? However, I went and watched the recordings. I watched both the men's race and the women's race, and I have to admit there was some stuff in particular or exclusively on the men's side that literally made me laugh out loud with how brazen it was, how blatant it was with respect to guys cutting the course. So now the question becomes, what should we do about it? Should anything be done about it? Should teams be disqualified? Should individuals be disqualified? I look at it more as an opportunity just to take a look at what the actual rule is. And it's a good one with respect to knowing what we see in track running. We see so many disqualifications for athletes stepping inside the rail on the track or stepping, outside of their lane on the track. And there's obviously a literal interpretation of any rule, and then there's a spirit of the rule. We talk about this a lot, a spirit of what the rule is trying to uphold with respect to athletes trying to gain advantage. So what were we looking at here in this instance? Because I don't think anything is going to come out of this. I'm not sure if teams are protesting or not. It would seem potentially a little bit late for that. But either way, it's a really interesting situation. So the first thing we should do is have a look at the actual rule. And even though the track stitch band is off, the tech team is always working overtime. They managed to put this together for us. So this comes from the NCAA rulebook for both track, that covers indoor running and outdoor, and cross country. And this is section 5, running violations. And you can see sort of down the bottom there in clause F, gains a meaningful advantage by failing to complete the prescribed course that is defined by a legal marking system. Okay, so that seems pretty straightforward. I think the only thing that is potentially a little bit ambiguous there is the term meaningful advantage, and I think that's what we should look at first. So getting back to some of the things that we see in track, and it's kind of a universal rule across, from the USATF through to World Athletics, through to NCAA, they're all very, very similar rules. We see so many athletes are disqualified for stepping on the inside of the track, even just one or two steps inside on the curve. Now, there's a difference, obviously, between sprinting and distance running. Sprinting, where the sort of margins of victory are a lot tighter. It is, I guess it's geometry, trigonometry, physics, whatever you want to call it, that if you do run inside your lane, you are technically running a slightly shorter distance. In the sprints, I think that makes more of a difference because each sprint race technically is more like an individual time trial that happens simultaneously against your opponents. It's not like an 800-meter race upwards, or in this case, a cross-country race where you're sort of running, you've got all this dynamic of competing against other athletes. they dictate where you are able to be on the track, etc. They can encroach on your space. There's all these other dynamics. So I think you got to separate between sprints and distance. But I think this comes down to, again, literal interpretation of the rule and what the spirit of the rule is looking to uphold. The first thing that jumped into my mind was the case of Eric Holt from last year at the US Olympic trials. I know a lot of you will know the story of Eric, 800, 1500 runner from the US. He's a very, very good domestic US runner, 3:32.9 for 1500. And he put all his eggs in his basket last year for the US trials, as an athlete should do. He had a great season. He set PRs over 800, 1500, and 3K, turned up in Eugene in great shape. Had a bit of a disappointment in the 1500. He didn't make the final, but he came back really strong in the 800. And in the semi-final, he ran 1:45.05 to finish fourth. And the system was the classic 3 semi-finals where they took the first 2 and the next 2 fastest times. So he can finish fourth in 1:45.05, which was fast enough to qualify him for the final. And there was a great moment after the race when his name popped up on the scoreboard with a little cue. He sort of hugged Shane Cohen, and the announcer mentioned that he'd made the race. And then tragically, in the mix zone afterwards, he found out that he had been disqualified because he took 1 or 2 steps on the inside of his lane in the opening 100 meters before the break line, right? And these are the kinds of instances that drive me crazy. So full disclosure, I am not a rules tyrant with respect to these rules at all. I do not believe that you need to just look at every case so black and white and take the rule absolutely literally. There has to be an adjudication on the spirit of the rule, and is the athlete trying to circumvent what the spirit of the rule is? In so many of these races where athletes do this, this is not the case, right? In the case of Eric Holt, he is not looking to gain an advantage from taking 1 or 2 steps on the inside of his lane in the opening 100 meters of an 800, because by the time that he hits the break line anyway and joins the field, that minuscule advantage is completely nullified anyway. If you did want to have an advantage as well and even risk getting disqualified, you are certainly taking more than 1 or 2 steps. And for Eric, if you've seen him run, he's an interesting runner. He's sort of a bit sort of ungainly in his form, and he was probably on that start line leaning over, incredibly nervous. He sort of just probably stumbled a little bit. I don't know, but either way, 1 or 2 steps is not worth a disqualification. And then we see these all the time in big distance races where athletes are running on the rail. They sort of, there's space impeded on them. They sort of close up and they take 1 or 2 steps just to avoid bringing down the field potentially, right? And they get disqualified for that too, which is absurd because, again, just to put this out there, it is not easy in the middle of a race to step over a little rail, and this is specifically track running, that is sticking about an inch off the ground, right? It is actually dangerous to do that. You don't want to do that. It is a disruption to your rhythm. It is a safety issue for you. So some of these disqualifications are just absolutely crazy. So that brings us to what we saw in cross country today. Now, in cross, we know that there are far more athletes, particularly in the early stages of races, running in the pack than there are on the track. And you can be running on the inside of the field, going around the apex of a curve with potentially 10, 15, 20 athletes on your outside, all compressing over the top of you as they're trying to round that curve. So it's not easy. There has to be a little bit of leeway. And you will see this all the time on the course, athletes taking multiple steps on inside I guess it's the chalk or the painted line in this instance. You see this all the time, and clearly you cannot go through and disqualify all these athletes. That would be like calling a holding penalty in football on every play if you were going to the letter of the law, because it happens on every single play. However, what we saw today in the NCAA cross men's race, I believe, is not just going against what the literal interpretation of the law is. Most importantly, it is going against what the essence or the spirit of the rule is meant to be. So let's take a look at what I'm talking about. Again, the Track Stitch tech team has done an amazing job with this one. We're going to go and have a look at 2 really classic instances. I know a number of you would have seen these already, but let's have a look at what is going on and see if there is any difference here between this and say in a track race where an athlete takes 1 or 2 steps on the infield because they have to avoid creating some catastrophic situation. All right. So the first one here, we're at just under 4K. We're about 11 minutes into the race. And, I mean, what are we doing here? Like, officials like, get on the course. No, we're running on the left of the hay bales there. I mean, so this to me is an example of the differences that I'm talking about. When you take 1 or 2 steps, say in a 5 or 10K race, on the inside of the track as you're rounding like a curve, right, you are not gaining any real material advantage here. The only instance where you would is if you used that space where there's no other athletes to pass the field and reinsert yourself in the race, exactly like what we just saw there with those dudes running around the corner, right? They are using the inside of the course where there is nobody there to advance their position in the race. The fact that they have the ability to do so, because they've clearly got some energy in their legs to be able to pass that many people on the inside, is irrelevant, right? Like, those guys at the front of the race have earned the right to run the shortest distance unimpeded by getting out in front and being out in front. And you made the decision to not do that by running back in the pack. Just because you have the energy to make that move does not mean that you can do so illegally. Like, that to me is on both levels, literal interpretation of the rule and what the essence or the spirit of the rule is. You are breaking that in a premeditated fashion, right? You are clearly running off the course there. There is no excuse for that one at all. I don't understand how that is not worthy of a disqualification. Are these athletes going to be DQ'd? I've got no idea, but that's just my feeling. If you are not going to enforce the rule from what we just saw there, I don't even know why you have a rule in the rule book. Okay, it's kind of that simple. But there is an incident that comes a little bit later in the race that I know we're going to have a look at now, which is potentially even more interesting because it involves some athletes from a team that actually did quite well. They won the team title. Let's just have a look at what happens here, because there are a number of facets to this particular moment that I think are worth discussing. So let's go back. Okay, so this is a little bit later in the race. This is about 21 minutes 50 in. This, by the way, is the lead pack. Now, I'm just going to pause it here because, and full disclosure, there is nothing personal at all with what I'm about to say here. This is not against any one individual athlete. This is not targeting anybody. This is just calling it the way I see it. But I want you to pay attention to the athlete from Oklahoma State. We're not going to name him, but he is on the shoulder, on the inside shoulder of Rocky Hansen. And as he is running right here, you can see clearly that he is running legally inside the white chalk. So we've got absolutely no problems. But we need to have a look at what happens as he approaches this curve coming up, right? So we've got athletes already running on the inside of the curve here, which is just crazy. I mentioned earlier about how potentially when there are a number of athletes on the outside of you, how, sometimes they just compress and they force you actually to take 1 or 2 steps, or maybe even 10 or 15 steps on the inside of the course, just purely out of safety. But the question is this move that's about to happen, does this come out of safety? So here we are approaching the apex of the curve, and all of a sudden we're on the inside. Oops, we're on the side of the hay bale. We're running a shorter distance. And here is another really interesting thing that I saw. So you can see as they're coming around on the curve here, not only have now what we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Not only do we have 7 athletes running a shorter distance on the inside of the course, right? They are running even on the inside of those hay bales, which, by the way, are placed or oriented in a certain fashion where they are clearly not obstructions that you are there to hurdle, right? Okay, so they are clearly there as some kind of marker to say, hey, this is the out of bounds area of the course. But what is really interesting here is look at this chopped up section of ground that the main field, which includes, Habtom Samuel, the eventual winner, Rocky Hansen guy finished second, Brian Musau is there as well. These guys have actually had to run wider themselves to avoid this chopped up section of the ground, whereas these guys on the inside have had this free run on this relatively good terrain, right? And they've also run shorter. So again, if we're looking back at the rule on both levels, on a literal interpretation and also in terms of the sentiment, this really appears like you are trying to circumvent what the spirit of the rule is meant to be. I'm really sorry. And now we're all back joined together. Who knows what that advantage actually materialized to, but it was absolutely something. Why? Because if there wasn't one, you wouldn't have done it. Now, I have heard some of the counters to this one. Oh, how much of an advantage does it really make? Oh, this happens all the time out on the course. I've even heard things like, well, they should have roped off the course or put more hay bales. Here's an interesting point on that one. The reason why you would not stake off and rope those corners is out of safety for the athletes. You need to think about some of those moments early in the races where there are a number of guys coming around the corners. Everybody's getting compressed. We know that athletes are going to take steps inside simply because they have to out of safety. If you've got steel rods sticking out of the ground linked together by ropes and flags, right? That is a recipe for disaster. The same if you were to put hay bales like a Formula One race, like a tire wall, like around those corners. Somebody is going to get forced into those hay bales and it is going to cause carnage in the race. What we need to be doing here is just using a little bit of common sense as athletes. I mean, this is not these guys' first rodeo, right? You are running the National Collegiate Athletic Association national championships for cross country here. This is not a middle school race or an elementary school race. Like, these guys have been there and done it before. And on top of that, we did not see the same thing happen in the women's race. So it appears that they seem to understand the concept of staying within the course markings as laid out by the rules. Why the guys were not doing that, why some of the guys were not doing that, I don't know. I guess it is what it is. So now the big question is, what should really happen? Should athletes be disqualified? Now, in the case I mentioned earlier of the Oklahoma State athlete, that would be extremely punitive to that program because they actually won the team title. I believe that their next scoring athlete would be an 86 position. That is 81 point difference from the athlete there who was, I believe, unfortunately, flaunting the rules a little bit. So that would have large implications for the team title. It doesn't appear like, as of now, the afternoon here, that any protests have actually been formed. But then again, I think it just comes back to this more so just being an interesting situation for us to look at and say, wow, we are disqualifying athletes on the track side for these kinds of indiscretions, but we are prepared to look the other way when it comes to cross country. And actually, the rules for both track and for cross are almost, in terms of their wording, almost exactly as similar. You cannot run on the inside of the marked course in order to gain an advantage. In my opinion, were those guys gaining an advantage? Yes, they were. That's just my opinion. It doesn't mean that it's right. So moving forward, what are we going to do? I just said it. I don't know if anything's going to come of this, but maybe this is just a good opportunity for the NCAA to reset with respect to almost maybe the informing of athletes prior to the race that, hey, guys, we really have to, within the bounds of common sense, stay on the race course, please. If you are seen using parts of the course that are not the official race, that are not within the marked areas, if you are going to use those to your advantage, you are going to be disqualified in the future. It seems like in the past, those things were just sort of implied and they didn't need to be necessarily said. Maybe they need to now. It is a very competitive environment out there. Everybody is looking to gain some kind of advantage that they can. Anyway, that's about all I have to say on this one. At the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It's just running, but really interesting situation. Definitely worth talking about. Want to say congratulations again to the athletes there, especially to the winners, Doris Lemongol, and on the men's side, Hampton Samuel. That's all we have for you, and we will catch you next week back on the main version of the Track Stitch podcast. Peace and have a great weekend.